Hello, everyone, and welcome to our ASCM webinar, The Coronavirus Impact on Global Supply Chains, co-sponsored by Supply Chain Canada. My name is Kim Monroe, Marketing Manager at ASCM. And before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. At the end of the presentation, we will save time for a few question and answers. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click Send. If you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar Technical Support at 1-805-617-7000. We'd also like to let you know that this presentation is being recorded and it will be emailed to all registrants early next week. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today. Elizabeth Rennie is Senior Manager of Publications and Editor-in-Chief of SCM Now Magazine for the Association of Supply Chain Management. She sets the direction of ASCM's digital and print content, ensuring it delivers value to readers across industries, locations, and job functions. Beth also heads up the ASCM Awards of Excellence, the premier international supply chain awards program. Welcome, Beth.
Thanks, Kim. Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased that you're here today, and I'm especially happy to be joined by two supply chain risk management experts for this important event. First, Jim Kilpatrick is the Global Supply Chain and Network Operations Leader for Deloitte Consulting and the head of its consumer products industry in Canada. He has more than 25 years of experience at Deloitte, having held multiple client and industry leadership positions at the regional and global levels. Jim's expertise includes supply chain strategy, planning, distribution and logistics, strategic sourcing and procurement, and manufacturing operations. And we also have Gregory Schlegel, CPIM, who is founder of the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium, executive in residence in Supply Chain Risk Management at Lehigh University, an adjunct professor of Enterprise Risk Management at Villanova University, and the Vice President of Business Development at ShareTrack LLC. He is a frequent speaker at ASCM conferences, and I personally have had the pleasure of working with Jim numerous times over the years, as he is a frequent contributor to SCM Now Magazine. So welcome, gentlemen. Our first question today, the coronavirus, or more specifically COVID-19, has crossed an inflection point, with events outside China now exceeding those within the country. As of this week, the outbreak has affected more than 115,000 people and has been detected in upwards of 100 countries. As consumer confidence weakens and people increasingly put off discretionary spending, aviation, tourism, hospitality, and consumer goods are primed to see lost or at least delayed demand. Jim, let's start with you. How long do you think these demand shocks will continue, and which sectors will be most deeply affected?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for asking. It's always a good way to start. I think the one challenge we have is that this started as a China problem, and through most of the month of February, everybody was focused on the implications of China as a customer, an industrial customer, as well as a major consumer market. But the challenge is that now, as you pointed out, with more than 110 countries experiencing positive cases of the virus, and a number of containment measures being enacted in places like Italy, South Korea and beyond, this isn't just a China problem anymore. So I think what we're going to see is that the demand shocks are going to continue for a while. There's still a lot of uncertainty as to exactly the implication this will have in countries beyond Japan. But we're going to see China. We're going to see China start to recover as other countries are being impacted. So I think you characterized it well, that there's two elements. One is lost demand and one is shifted demand. So in cases in the past, when we look at SARS, the industries that you mentioned are the first to get impacted. It's tourism, it's hospitality, it's entertainment, it's luxury goods, as we saw some of the early warners of earnings shortfalls from China being Canada Goose, Burberry, and companies like that. It's companies with perishables, where they can't get them to market, so they have to either find other markets or risk losing those goods. It certainly impacted retail in China as consumer shopping behaviors changed pretty dramatically and purchasing behavior went with it. And of course, the real estate companies that own those shopping malls. In the shifted demand space, I think we're going to see, and we've already seen impacts to industry supply chains like automotive and high tech. Certainly the automotive supply chain was one of the first to announce plant closures due to shortages of parts. That is an exceptionally lean supply chain that relies on just-in-time inventory practices, so therefore there wasn't much of a buffer when suppliers were disrupted. And I think, while all the focus is right now on lost demand, shifted demand, there are some winning industries in here as well. Certainly healthcare and life sciences, are being positively impacted, at least in the short term, by some of the demand for those services, as well as certain CPG companies. So there are some at the end of the day that will experience a short-term positive lift. But at the end of the day, those are the industries right now. It's going to be broad. This is probably one of the first crises that has impacted so many different industry supply chains at once. And I think what we're going to see is a rolling impact that will last for a while. China, as we speak, is starting to recover. Outside of Wuhan, most retail stores are open, although largely on, sort of modified hours. But unfortunately, as China recovers, other markets will be impacted. So this is not likely a situation that goes away anytime soon.
Yes, thank you, Jim. And Greg, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I would just add to Jim. He covered it quite well. The aviation sector, the aviation industry, in our view, has been impacted from a demand shock point of view, and the net from beginning to end, we hear from our partners, it could be anywhere from 20 to 30 weeks in duration.
Wow. All right, well, on the other side of the coin, factories are continuing to close in order to protect their workers. We're also seeing opportunists exploiting demand for medical supplies such as face masks and hand sanitizer. In fact, Amazon has taken down more than 1 million listings because of price gouging related to the virus. Jim, let me follow up by asking you, how long do you think it will be before supply shocks actually turn into massive shortages?
Well, again, that's a great question. I think, we're seeing a couple of issues. The first one, as you point out in your question, is that we've seen some irrational demand. Irrational demand for face masks, irrational demand for sanitizers, irrational demand for personal hygiene products. Where people are stockpiling, perhaps the Corona pantry, if you will. I think a lot of that is going to be relatively limited, though, and relatively short-lived. The real issue, as you point out, is the supply side disruption that was caused, starting in China when a number of plants took extended shutdown. The timing of this was a little bit fortunate on the one hand that all of China was shutting down for the Lunar New Year anyways. So that's a very significant holiday in China and really allowed workers to go back to their hometowns. But the first movement by the government to support containment was to extend those shutdowns. Well, of course, many people had ordered in advance of those shutdowns knowing it was coming, but the extended shutdown has caused a number of impacts already in major global supply chains. If you position China as the world's factory, what is it like to shut down that factory for what is looking like about 2 months now? Many parts of China, the factories are back up and running, but are still at limited capacity, and it's likely going to be April before the factories, are running anything close to a normal environment. And what we saw was that companies that had visibility to their suppliers, directly in China, were able to take quick action. But they didn't have visibility to the second-tier suppliers, and that's really the domino effect that caught many companies by surprise. Just because you have a sewing operation that you've moved to Taiwan doesn't mean that the zippers and the fasteners and the other things which are coming from China aren't actually the issues that caused you the major shock. So I think what we've seen is, already a number of industries, some of them more public than others, are experiencing very significant supply shortages. Of course, in the FDA and life sciences, drug companies are forced to announce supply shortages, and we're already seeing a number of companies announce shortfall of very important drugs. We've seen impacts in the automotive industry that have shut down complete plants. We've seen impacts in the consumer products industry as some companies have come public with the degree of exposure they have to China. So I think we are seeing, a fairly significant impact already. And although China is starting to recover, the challenge now is where does this go next from a global perspective? And most analysts are very, very concerned as we look at the key industrial markets of Korea, of Germany, of the US, and of Japan. And all of those markets right now are experiencing accelerated positive cases of COVID-19. So it'll be, ultimately still uncertain as to what the ultimate supply chain impact is. But that's right now where most attention is being placed.
And Greg, what are your thoughts on the potential of ongoing shortages and their global effects?
Yeah, I would follow up and just append to what Jim mentioned is the supply chain visibility. Through your tier 1, tier 2, and all the way to your tier N suppliers. Those cascading effects are what will ultimately prove to be the total length of recovery, in our opinion. If you have good visibility in your supply chain upstream and downstream, you probably have prepared the best you can. It's just a function of the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, because those tiers, as Jim well knows, are much smaller, don't have the tools, techniques, resources, and so forth. So it's very difficult to plan out when a massive shortage might take effect in certain industries, but it will be predicated on those tier 2 and beyond capabilities through all sectors.
Yes, and ideally, supply chain organizations should have sort of already been thinking about this. They should already have a risk management plan and playbook in place, and that should be the outcome of thoughtful supply chain mapping and a thorough risk assessment. Greg, you really are the risk management guru. I'm curious to know if you think there's actually still time to make adjustments, and if so, what are some strategies that can still have a positive effect now?
It is a good question. We deal with those threads of good supply chain risk every day with our clients and our students. There is time. I'd like to preface some of those short-term recommendations with our Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium. We're aware of about 250 companies worldwide who exercise almost all the tools, techniques, and methodologies we teach at Lehigh, what we advocate in the Apex ASCM Supply Chain Risk Certificate, and in our book. So these companies are better prepared and more responsive than most, and will probably fare better during this black swan risk event. Why? Because they've perhaps digitized their supply chains. They're able to model their supply chains and to run scenarios prior to a risk event. In fact, many exemplar companies started this process during the tariff wars last year. So they were going through trade-offs and cost-benefit analysis while the trade dialogue was getting rougher and rougher. So they're now exercising these risk response plans within their own supply chain risk war rooms, where many of them watch and view their supply chain 24/7 for risk events. On the other side, those who chose not to prepare their supply chains for disruptions of any type are now working 24/7 in an ad hoc mode just to survive. It's normally all hands on deck, and there's normally no guarantee of survival. So now I'll get to the original question. Is there time? Yes, but the horse is out of the gate. Short term, we'd recommend these tactics. First, ensure the safety of your staff and partners. Follow the CDC guidelines to the best of your ability. Over communicate across your entire supply chain on a regular basis. Next, identify critical materials and communicate what we call an inventory runout analysis to your executives. How long will it take before we run out of material and or parts to service our customers? Next, identify your key suppliers. in the affected areas and stay in contact with them hourly. And finally, attempt to secure alternative sources of supply or logistics and manufacturing capacity if you can, and be advised you will pay a premium for those resources.
Yes, I'm sure you will. And Jim, what are your thoughts on some useful short-term tactics, even if the horse that Greg mentioned has already left the gate?
Yeah. I mean, as Greg was talking, I was thinking this is a very thorough answer that Greg has just given. But I have many similar sentiments to what Greg has expressed, and maybe I could just amplify a couple of points. The first one is that, as I step back and think about this particular event, some people call it a black swan event because you really couldn't see it coming. I mean, realistically, who in December, would have said that in January when they show up back to work, there's going to be this virus that's going to take the world by surprise and shut down supply chains. Perhaps you would have thought about war and terrorism, perhaps you would have thought about some wicked trade wars or some other kind of event, but I don't think any of us could have ever seen this. So as a result, the way this is played out, I would say there is no playbook, and there's no playbook because the last time we had an event like this, it either impacted a single supply chain in Japan with the Great East tsunami and earthquake, or it was SARS, way back in 2003. And man, the world's changed a lot since then by way of globalization of supply chains, China's role in the supply chains, and everything else. But I would say, like Greg, number one is that many parts of the world have yet to really be hit in a big way. So there is time to get ahead. The horse, I mean, this is impacting supply chains. So the horse is out of the barn. Perhaps the containment measures of China bought everybody some time, but there's still time to get ahead of this. Greg's given a number of good advice on things to do now, and certainly, everybody needs to be thinking about a holistic risk assessment and action planning, and some are better prepared for that than others, and some are certainly scrambling. The one thing I would give advice on is that I'm seeing a lot of blanket, types of initiatives, and I suppose in the effort for speed, doing something directionally right is good. But a blanket mandate perhaps to say, let's raise all inventories by 20% just in case is generally not the right decision to do. So I think as supply chain professionals, let's make good decisions fast, and perfection's the enemy of good. But some of these decisions do need a level of precision, or else they could have unintended consequences. So that would be one thing I might add.
Gotcha. So many supply chain professionals are wondering if it's going to be even possible to avoid a global slowdown. And worse than that, lots of people are wondering if we might be looking at pandemic and ultimately recession. History shows us that the companies that weather crises such as these are generally those with lots of cash flow. So Greg, what steps can businesses take to ensure liquidity now and in the foreseeable future?
It is a good question. And in fact, our perspective on this is cash is known as a red line issue. Right? Without cash flow, you don't have a business. So these major black swan events, which we think can take up to 20 to 30 weeks to play out, that means continued cost escalation with potentially no sales. And that is very, very ominous. All right. So our recommendation would be, no matter how large or small you are, first and foremost, get in there and calculate your free cash flow going forward, at least through June, July of 2020. Maybe you might want to calculate and effectively manage what we call cash conversion cycle. That's receivables, days of supply plus inventory, days of supply minus payables days. And we say that because the banks and the insurance companies know all about cash conversion, and that's a very good metric of supply chain efficiency and effectiveness in our point of view. All right. You might want to think about fast tracking your internal approval process for emergency spending. Maybe keep in communication with your banks for lines of credit. Maybe evaluate your customer contracts if you can for penalty clauses along with your suppliers. Folks tend to not remember that. Potentially look at running what we call allocation process for your key customers. As product becomes short, either material or parts, you have to start looking at your key suppliers to essentially keep them in business as well. Two other elements, maybe you want to identify products that can be stopped from a manufacturing point of view so you can make capacity available for others to support that allocation to your key customers. And then finally, if you have purchased supply chain disruption insurance, and it is out there, it is a mitigation tactic and technique, begin to exercise that insurance policy as needed and communicate with your insurer, because that type of insurance can offset some of your accumulated costs during the risk event.
Right. And Jim, what is Deloitte recommending with regards to maintaining cash flow?
Well, it's great question again, and Greg has covered it very well. There's probably more levers to pull on the cash flow side than most people have thought through. Cash to cash conversion cycles obviously are one of the most important metrics, but stopping the spend in discretionary or non-important things is also something that many companies need to consider. I would say that I 100% align to the need to recast cash flows at this point under a variety of scenarios. You may think this all comes back to normal in China starting in April and the rest of the world shortly after, but as Greg pointed out, at least until June, July, but also under a number of scenarios is how this could play out for your business. I think it does introduce an incremental risk. Right now, most people are looking at risk of supply, meaning parts, inventories, raw materials, but there's also a risk that your suppliers could go out of business, if they're actually in a precarious place. And so I think that's something to be monitored. As Greg pointed out, don't go and arbitrarily extend your accounts payable terms to a supplier that's on the brink and end up putting them out of business, or you've got a bigger issue. I would say that, I think at the end of the day, cash will be king. It's important for companies to understand where their position is. Those that are flush with cash, might be able to help out in the extended supply chain. There's a number of companies that we're seeing already declare bankruptcy where COVID has pushed them over the edge. Those are, airlines or insurance companies or restaurants that were quickly hit. So companies that were in a bad spot, this just made it worse. But frankly, there's a number of companies that probably took cash flow for granted because they were profitable and high performing. But as they make decisions that could tie up inventory, or could tie up their cash, they run the risk of getting into a position that they'd rather not be in. So everybody is well advised, not just to focus on ensuring continuity of supply, but also continuity of cash flow.
Right. All right, so we've previously touched on the increased demand on healthcare facilities around the world. Unfortunately, some are finding themselves overwhelmed by a flood of patients or facing shortages of essential supplies. These healthcare companies have been warned that there is a strong potential for this to be a long road ahead. So I'm curious what advice you might offer to the people running these organizations with regards to preparedness, inventory management, patient safety protocols. So Greg, can you get us started, please?
Yeah, sure. I would say we would touch on some of the tactics, short-term tactics that we already talked about. One would be first ensure the safety of your patients and your staff. And again, we would recommend following the CDC guidelines to the best of your ability. Over-communicate. You can over-communicate, but you must over-communicate with your patients and staff. Keep them and your partners, keep them enlightened every hour of the day. Potentially secure additional temporary resources if that's possible and if it's needed. Maybe again, from a healthcare point of view, calculate your inventory again. We like to call it run out analysis. How much material, how many drugs do you have available, and when will they run out based on the existing demand plus what you're seeing every day, and communicate daily with your suppliers based on that run out analysis. Maybe reach out to your insurers and revisit all your coverages. And if you do not practice business continuity protocols as a healthcare facility, we would recommend seek out professional organizations who can lead, guide, direct, and coach you to develop these business continuity protocols. You can begin now, and in order to better prepare yourself for the next risk event.
Thanks, Greg. And Jim, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think this is an element of the ecosystem that many people probably don't consider as we look at core industrial and consumer-oriented supply chains. Certainly COVID is, with the positive cases, is impacting the healthcare system, and I put that as an ecosystem partner in this case. I think, my perspective is that if the healthcare system is treated like a constrained asset, and this is amplifying some of the points Greg made. As a constrained asset, one of the first things you want to do is figure out how to reduce demand on it. And that comes from a lot of the tactics Greg mentioned, education, providing good information, not misinformation, the containment practices many people are implementing to ensure the safety and health of their employees. There's a number of things that are being done in societies and communities to reduce demand. Second one, obviously, is in capacity planning. And getting lessons from my partners on the ground in places like India and China. There's an element of hospital capacity that can be freed up by deferring discretional procedures, that can be deferred on short notice. I'm not suggesting that all hospitals need to go cancel surgeries tomorrow. Obviously, that has a different implication, but on short notice, it is possible to to defer some of these elective procedures and free up capacity. And then we get into the issue, lastly, of inventory management. This is a real issue. Obviously, we brought it up earlier with surgical masks and, some of the demand on supplies that hospitals rely on. It's very important for healthcare organizations to revisit inventory policy quickly. Many haven't established, what's called strategic stock. They need to work with their suppliers. The suppliers have a key role in this, in allocation of inventory to healthcare providers and making sure that the system works, that one organization isn't available to hoard at the expense of others. And certainly putting inventory controls in place and making sure that even within that healthcare system, that inventory is appropriately allocated. I think many healthcare systems have seen shrinkage and a run on surgical masks and other medical supplies within their own organization, and they've chosen to now lock down certain types of inventory and put very strict cycle counting and other procedures around it. Perhaps it's unfortunate that it came to that, but sometimes fear drives crazy behavior. So I think inventory policy and inventory control and working with suppliers will be fundamental.
Thanks, Jim. So sort of speaking of stockouts and this crazy demand that we're seeing, a store with nothing to sell has a supply problem, and a store with no customers, of course, has a demand problem. So in a black swan situation like the one we're facing, it's not long before people unfortunately lose their jobs at the first store and then are no longer able to shop at the second. This is obviously very emotionally taxing, and people's lives are changing right now in extraordinary ways. It's really important for businesses to educate their employees about things like symptoms and prevention, perhaps allowing flexible sick leave or work from home policies, especially now that some schools are starting to close. Of course, many are restricting non-essential traffic. So Jim, I'm curious, what are some specific things that companies can do to protect and support their employees at this very difficult time?
Well, great question again, and I am glad that we are discussing the people side of this equation. It's easy as supply chain professionals to talk about demand shocks and, assurance of supply and how to manage operations. But at the end of the day, this is largely, right now anyways, in most parts of the world, a people issue. And I can tell you that chief human resource officers are very much searching, for, what is the right balance? What response is appropriate to the risk? And truly, this is a moment that matters. It's not only what you do, but how you do it. Employees are looking for true leadership at the top. They're looking for calm. They're looking for communication, and they're also, not looking for overreaction. So you named in your question, actually, you gave a number of the things that people are doing to protect, ensure the safety and health of employees. Certainly travel is an easy one. Many people have already implemented restricted and revised travel policies. Some are linked specifically to CDC and World Health Organization guidelines as to which countries are most at risk. Some have implemented broader measures and blanket measures. As a supply chain professional, I personally believe that that's could be an example where a blanket measure isn't the right way to go, and we could be more precise. And I also think that blanket policies, although maybe fast and maybe appropriate to take action, need to be monitored, because the world, as we talked earlier, is being disrupted at different times. Markets that were hit early and impacted early, like China, are starting to recover, and they're now very worried about the rest of the world, coming back to them. But new markets are being impacted, as we speak. So, I think we need to monitor and revise policies. We talked, I think, in your question about education, making sure people have the facts and that people have reliable sources of information, because there's no shortage of misinformation, out there and available. Communication is key. The tone needs to be set at the top. People want constant communication. I was talking with an executive team the other day, and they said they realized quickly that any gap in communication or silence is quickly perceived as a disaster, by their employees. So constant flow of communication is key. Many companies are implementing screening protocols. Many companies have increased workforce hygiene. Many companies are promoting remote work. In some cases, HR departments are proactively looking to identify or get people to self-declare those with pre-existing conditions that'll be more susceptible, and proactively moving to remote work, even though their particular geography may not yet be impacted. So there's a number of things people are doing, to protect the health and safety of workers. And I think this is a time when, as organizations and leadership are moving from, the bottom line being the only thing that's important, and to really demonstrating purpose as an organization. At the end of the day, this is going to be a true moment that matters for leadership, and making sure that the people side of this crisis are properly addressed will be critical.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially the whether or not a blanket policy is the right course of action. Greg, what are your thoughts on that?
I would just add, again, the people side. I think Jim is spot on. We're seeing a lot more work from home, and that's good, and a lot more web conference calls, just to mitigate the risk of the spread of the virus. So those are two, from a people point of view, that we've seen in the last 4 to 5 weeks.
Greg, if I were just to, not to pile on your answer to my answer, but in some cases, this may change, what work looks like in the future. Many organizations today aren't set up really to enable remote work in a broad way. Obviously, I come from a consulting organization that spends a lot of time on the road and has a lot of remote workers, but many organizations aren't set up the way we are, and even within Deloitte, we have a large pool of people that comes to the office every day. And so, as companies figure out how to enable the workforce and workforce flexibility, I think what we may see is that some of the practices that were initiated in this time of crisis, may actually help to make workplaces and work environments and the nature of how work is done different in the future in a positive way.
Jim, I would agree. We actually coined this work disruptions.
All right, well, shifting from the employee people side to the customer people side, businesses that navigate disruptions successfully often do so because they really invest in their core customer segments, and they are therefore able to anticipate changing behaviors. I think one obvious shift that we're going to see more and more is people choosing to shop online. So Jim, you have a lot of experience in this regard. What should supply chain professionals be doing to enhance the breadth and quality of their omnichannel offerings, as well as their distribution and logistics capabilities?
Number one, there was significant clampdown on traffic and containment. And so a number of people, had a difficult time, going to traditional shopping malls. At the same time, there was a, exceptional risk in being in group settings, especially in Wuhan, the most impacted area. And what we saw was a tremendous surge in online. And I think many organizations aren't set up for that. Online shopping is actually far more advanced in China and other parts of the world than it is in North America in general. So I would say that there's a couple of things people need to do. We talked earlier about the demand side implications of this and whether demand was lost or deferred. But what we didn't talk about was whether demand was shifted, to a different channel or way of getting to consumers. And that's really, what you're asking here is what happens when demand shifts and goes from traditional retail to perhaps online. Looking at some of the lessons learned of the companies in China that were impacted, number one is that many companies, had segmented inventory or separated inventory for their online business versus their retail business. And so I think it's very important, first and foremost, to have an integrated view of inventory and to anticipate that some of your demand is most likely going to shift to online channels. And those companies that aren't agile and continue to separate the inventories won't be able to respond. The second thing is that a number of companies just plain didn't have the capacity to handle the volume that was coming in, and that's capacity in the distribution center and capacity in the last mile and getting it from a distribution center or a point of supply, whether that be a store or micro fulfillment center or otherwise, ultimately to the consumer. Well, there's many ways to be able to scale up that capacity, and so I'd advise companies to start thinking about that, whether this shift in demand is applicable for their business and their supply chain, and if so, how would they be prepared to respond as they start to see it?
Gotcha. All right, we previously talked a little bit about digitizing supply chains and the benefits of that kind of capability. Today's digital networks are essential to helping supply chain professionals anticipate disruptions, mitigate negative impact, handle a volatile marketplace. Jim, what types of tools and technologies should supply organizations be exploring in order to build these effective digitally enabled risk management capabilities?
Great question. And I think, Greg talked earlier when he was talking about, I believe, Greg, it was 250 companies or so that are very well prepared, that have implemented the practices around risk management that we'd expect. And a lot of that relies on technology. And, as I look, at what we have helped do over the last couple of decades, we have helped supply chains globalize. We have helped lean out supply chains to take unnecessary inventory out, which helps that cash to cash conversion cycle. We have helped to optimize plant and distribution networks to help assets run near full capacity 24/7, focused on OEE and other metrics. We've helped companies go out and source in low-cost countries and, defragment supplier bases to drive cost out. It's all been great stuff, but it has exposed, supply chains. We've taken slack out of the system. We've reduced their ability to absorb shocks like this. And a lot of people would say, well, maybe we over-engineered it. But when the dust settles on this, like other crises, as I step back, it's going to be very hard to tell a CEO or an executive team that we have to put fat back in the system. Maybe we should increase our days of inventory supply across the board just in case. That's a pretty tough one when cash is still king. Maybe we should add capacity back in the network that we don't really need, but just in case. Tough one. Maybe we should go and introduce measures that put costs back in the system, but we might not be able to pass it on to our customers. Tough one. So these are all very important metrics, and it will cause companies to rethink what's the appropriate balance for sure. But all of the traditional supply risk mitigation techniques have had this overhead attached to them. Overhead of inventory, overhead of capacity, overhead of cost that was not very palatable to the executive teams. But what I'm really looking forward to is how do we leverage information to buffer risks in the supply chain with far less overhead? And that's where, as we move forward with digital supply networks, the ability to see across the extended supply chain that Greg brought up earlier, multiple tiers deep, and then to orchestrate that supply chain in a very collaborative way, using Internet of Things technologies, using technologies around AI and machine learning, using technologies of 3G and telecom communications there's all these emerging technologies that enable us to put, really a digital supply network together that allows us to buffer risk with far less overhead. And I think that this black swan event as it is, as people learn from it and the shock that it actually caused, I think this will help companies to rethink their physical supply chain and move to a much more digital model that can be much more efficient and collaborative and synchronized in the future.
And Greg, so Jim mentioned IoT, AI, ML. What other specific tools and technologies would you recommend companies looking into?
From a pure risk point of view, I mean, we the consortium are totally aligned with Deloitte and Jim's DSN, Digital Supply Network. We absolutely agree with that, because one of our mantras is what you don't know about your supply chain can and will hurt you. We advocate 3 digital approaches or solution approaches to help folks help themselves in terms of identifying, assessing, mitigating, and managing risks in a complex supply chain. Those 3 are digital alert solutions. There are solution providers out there right now, software as service, who scan the world every 30 minutes and look for all types of risk events, whether it's tornadoes, hurricane, weather, terrorism, this impact such as the coronavirus, because speed is life in supply chain risk. So digital alert solutions, you can subscribe to them. Secondarily, we advocate digitizing your supply chain. Every supply chain can be digitized. Folks have been doing it for 50 years now, and there's a lot of software solution providers out there who can digitally model your supply chain. Why do we advocate that? Because once your supply chain is digitally modeled with all the nodes across your supply chain, you can then run discrete event simulation to more or less watch or witness how your supply chain will react to a certain stimuli, whether it's risk-oriented, whether it's a business initiative. So 3 things: alert systems, digitize your supply chain, and then we advocate running discrete event simulation to witness how your supply chain will react to certain stimuli.
All right, thank you. All right, the bullwhip effect is a serious concern in a situation like this one. A retailer sees less demand, so it cuts orders from wholesalers. The wholesalers, of course, see the same thing and cut orders to the manufacturers by often an even greater percentage. This is, of course, particularly damaging for smaller suppliers. Previously, we talked about the fact that many suppliers are in a precarious place, but there are ways we can help our partners. So Greg, let me ask you, how can companies communicate more effectively in order to support those vulnerable suppliers? And most importantly, make sure that these suppliers are able to respond when demand does pick up again?
Well, it's a great question. We've talked a little bit. Jim mentioned it as well. I think I touched on it. Supply chain agility and flexibility. Those companies who have exercised those tools, techniques, and methodologies are going to fare better, even if they're in a JIT and lean arena. They've developed agility and flexibility, perhaps even alternative suppliers, and so they will probably come back quicker than most because of the agile nature and flexibility nature of their supply chains. There's another aspect to this. We talked about many of the large exemplar companies in supply chain risk. Many of these companies have developed what we call captives inside their company. This means they're self-insured, which means they can assist key suppliers in a supply chain risk event. Many of these exemplars, again, have these types of tools, techniques, technology, and approaches, such as supply chain risk management teams these exemplars have folks who have supply chain risk in their title. They have teams that essentially their sole job every day is to identify, assess, mitigate, and manage supply chain risks. They have continuous funding, and many of them operate supply chain risk war rooms, which monitor risk in their supply chain 24/7 across their entire global enterprise. And they also tend to have crisis management teams, and they're ready to visit affected suppliers. Again, suppliers that are smaller, the SMEs versus OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, those folks have crisis management teams. They're ready, willing, and able to visit the affected suppliers and or customers, and the key is to accelerate their time to recovery, which is a key risk management metric of success.
Yeah, definitely. So, Jim, what would you suggest, again, with that accelerating the time to recovery?
Well, I think eventually all supply chains recover. There's a lot embedded in the question and a lot of detail in Greg's response. I think as I step back and say, how did we get here? I mean, number one, nobody could have saw this coming. So that's part of how we got here. Part of it is that the way supply chains have been driven. I'm going to use a bit of a car analogy on this one, perhaps, as I think about it. We've had a lot of good historical backward-looking information. It's kind of like driving by looking in the rearview mirror. If you're going really slow, you could pull it off. You could see the subtle bend in the road, but you really need to be looking forward. Those companies that look forward probably only had good visibility to their direct customer. Depending on where in your supply chain, you still could be a ways away from a consumer. So when somebody up ahead, pumped the brakes or hit an obstacle and you didn't see it coming, we get a massive whiplash effect, and that goes way back through the supply chain. What I would say is that from where we are, and if you just use China as an example, where there's still a number of plants that haven't restarted and still a number of plants that are operating at very low capacity levels as workers return and as they get ungummed, restarting these supply chains is not going to be trivial. If you thought about it as a conveyor where you press the button and the power comes on and things start moving in synchronization, this is not what we're talking about. If you use the car analogy, if you're sort of in the middle of the traffic jam or the pileup, if you think you're ready to start and you fire up the engines, but the person in front of you isn't moving, that doesn't do a lot of good. And I think as supply, situations start to return to normal, a lot of what Greg talked about communication and collaboration is going to be vital. If you start making parts that aren't the priority parts of your customer, but they're good for you, that's not going to unjam these supply chains quickly. So setting priorities, communication, and working as quickly as possible to get to synchronization, I think, are going to be critical. I go back to a quote I heard from an automotive executive when the first plants were starting to shut down, and from the China crisis back in late February. He said, "You only have to be short one part to not be able to complete the car." So as these supply chains restart, it's going to be absolutely essential that everybody be on the same page with regards to what's most important for every player to produce.
Yep. All right. So as our final point before I turn it over to Q&A, many of us may feel that we are just starting to deal with COVID-19, but it will one day come to an end. So, Greg, what are the biggest challenges companies will face as they begin returning to that normal cadence that Jim was just talking about, when the cars start to run again, and how can they overcome some of these obstacles?
Very, very good question. It's a good follow-up to our last discussion. I guess a two-part answer that coming from our point of view. To us, one of the biggest challenges will be securing skilled labor again. This could involve remedial training, new hiring. We would say HR folks will be required to help accelerate the time to recovery that we've been chatting about for the last couple of threads. In terms of bringing the entire supply chain network, because one, companies don't compete against companies any longer. Supply chains compete against other supply chains. So, getting your supply chain in your industry sector back on its feet, it's all hands on deck again, including HR with the key element of people resources. With that said, ramping up capacity to prior levels will be dependent on labor resources and material supply, as Jim mentioned a while back. This is what we call in the industry supply chain latency, the time to recover. This is why we, along with insurance companies, again, talk about 25 to 30 week disruption duration with risk events this large. Longer term, a couple of supply chain risk strategies after survival are these. This is what we advocate to our clients and our workshop attendees and so forth. First and foremost, think about mapping your entire supply chain, preferably using digital models. You can do that. Second, identify the risks that occurred during this event and the ones that could occur tomorrow in your supply chain now that you can see all the nodes in your supply chain. Then plot those risks across your supply chain nodes and assess those risks because not all risks are the same. Next, develop risk response plans for the most impactful risks. Once you articulate the risks and assess those risks, then you can rank them, force rank them in descending order and pick and choose the most impactful and build some risk response plans. Then monitor your global risks. Maybe you want to subscribe to a risk alert system because speed is life in supply chain risk. Last two, maybe you want to run some what if scenarios regularly to see again how your supply chain will react to certain stimuli. And then finally, get educated on all the new tools, techniques, tactics, solutions that we talked about in this discussion, all in an effort to support identifying, assessing, mitigating, and managing supply chain risks. That would be our recommendation going forward.
Great, thank you, Greg. And Jim, anything to add?
Yeah, I think maybe just I'll step back a little bit from where Greg was, and Greg's given a number of really good recommendations for companies that aren't in that top 250 that he referred to that have mastered risk as to what companies need to be doing. If I were to go back, perhaps to my last statements and say that so restarting these supply chains is not going to be easy. So number one, what I would advise is companies at some point need to turn from defense to offense. They need to start preparing for the rebound. The initial work is obviously where are we exposed? How big are those risks? What's the probability we get hit by them under various circumstances? How can we secure alternate supply? How can we keep our factories running? How do we prevent shutdowns? There's a lot of defensive moves that need to be executed fast. But at some point, the rebound will come, and we're already seeing it in China. So companies need to start preparing and planning for that rebound. It goes back to some of the points perhaps around making sure your priorities with your key supply chain partners are entirely clear and that you rebound together in a very synchronized way. What I would say as well is that not everybody's going to come out of this undamaged. This isn't just about battening down and weathering the storm. Some companies are going to be severely impacted, unfortunately, from a cash flow perspective. There might be layoffs, as we're seeing already in some organizations. There might have to be some tough measures put in place. So depending on how you come out of this, will determine much of the action that happens. But I would say that how companies are responding in this moment are very important to their long-term, success and viability. It's how you're treating your people. Again, not what you're doing exactly as much as sometimes how you're doing it and how you're showing true leadership, but how you're communicating with your customers and how you're treating them. We talked way up front about the price gouging on Amazon, where somebody's looking for a temporary opportunity to make a profit. In some cases, the winners aren't going to be the ones that look to capitalize on this, but the ones that said, I'm here to help, and truly worked with the ecosystem, communities, as broadly as possible to make a difference in this moment of crisis. it's those companies that work with their suppliers in fair and reasonable ways to make sure that there was win-win solutions in place. And Greg gave a lot of good ideas about how do companies mitigate risk. I would like to go back to one of the challenges, with digitization of supply chains. And, I believe that the future is a far more digital supply chain. ASCM believes that as well. We're working in collaboration on digital capability models, but this is going to be a pretty dramatic shift in the capabilities of the supply chain profession. I'm excited we're working together on this, but I do think that as companies, look to become more digital, which is the future, they need to take very careful care of assessing where they are in their digital maturity and put in place very explicit programs to build that capability within their organization, to really be able to act and compete in the new world. And going back to my other statements, perhaps avoid some of the traditional overhead of buffering risk, being able to react, because I do honestly believe that the world is more digital than it is today. Those would be my final comments on Greg's response.
All right, thank you, Jim. And now I'm going to pass it to Kim for our question and answers.
Well, thank you, everyone. And now, as Beth mentioned, we've saved time for our question and answer session. And if you haven't already submitted a question, type your question in the questions box that's on the toolbar on your screen and click send. We don't have a lot of time here, so in the interest of time, Beth, let's go ahead. I see that there's a lot of questions that people have already sent in. If you wanted to go ahead and just get started.
Great. Yes, one question that I am seeing a lot has to do with if people should be concerned about shipments coming into their supply chains from other countries. Could something be carrying the virus and be dangerous? And I'll give that to Jim.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to respond to it. I think it's an important question because we're both understanding more and more about the virus. I've never seen anything in my supply chain career happen this fast. And so actions that were taken in mid-February, we're a lot smarter today than we were then. And there's also a lot of misinformation out there. Right now, to the best of my knowledge, there's really no proof that the virus continues to live on in any way as long as shipments coming from a contaminated region. So, right now I would say we don't need to be concerned about this particular issue. I've been contacted by cleaning companies offering solutions and perhaps maybe even looking to capitalize on this particular issue. But right now I'd say our perspective as supply chain professionals should be to work with the facts as they're available. And right now, I don't believe that we should be concerned about this particular issue of contaminated shipments with the virus from impacted countries.
All right, thank you. And another question many people are asking, another distribution and logistics question. Greg, how is container availability being affected?
It's a good question. From what we hear, we've heard from logistics companies inside the consortium and out, such as Cargometrics and DHL. One thing we've heard is blank sailings, they call them, have begun to lessen. They were very high during February, which for now implies availability of containers. However, it's not the containers that will impact the supply chain latency that Jim and I have been talking about in rebuilding and restarting the supply chain. It will probably be more around trucking, rail capacity, and how the ports, from a people resource point of view, how those three sectors, those will probably be the limiting factor in terms of getting jump-started in terms of multiple supply chains by sector.
Yeah, Greg, if I were just to add to that, I think the supply chain is a little out of sync right now and ports are congested. And, I do think it'll take a while to dig out of this, not only blank sailings, but canceled sailings. And, there are issues when the congestion at ports about, reefers being tied up for extended period of time, which obviously reefers are used for perishable products. So that has its own, consequential damage on top of it. But I do agree with all the points you made.
All right, thank you both. We talked a lot today about some new policies that some companies are enacting. One is working from home. So when you have more people working from home, obviously that is going to have implications on the network, the IT, people setting up home offices. I'm wondering what are some implications people are asking, of the more people working from home. And I'm sorry, I'll give that to Jim.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take. Yeah, I'd be happy to take it. It's a great question because, one of the strategies that every corporation is looking at right now is how do we enable remote and flexible work? And I mentioned earlier that the environment that I work in does facilitate a lot of remote work, but not exclusively. And the truth is that some of the points in the question, are exceptionally valid. Most companies, don't have VPN capability to support the amount of workload that's there. Internet bandwidth is not consistent around the world, and is something to be concerned with. Many people don't, have laptop computers that they can take home with them every night in case there's an issue, that their fundamental, device is a stationary desktop computer. And so there's implications now for the hardware devices that are mobile and can be taken home. There's implications for secure connectivity, to your applications. Some of those applications may not be designed to support remote access. There's implications for bandwidth. There's implications for cybersecurity if not done well. People that can pull data that's confidential to their home, people that are connecting with unsecure home internet connection devices. So, a lot of people say, well, enabling a remote workforce sounds like a good way to go and is easy. There's massive implications for IT departments to make this happen, and they're working quickly to do it.
Yeah. All right, so we have time for just one more question. I'm going to give this one to Greg, and I like this question very much from our audience. Someone wants to know if you can share some tips for talking with your customers about delays due to the coronavirus.
You bet. We have a few. First and foremost, identify your critical customers, because not all customers are the same either, and attempt to align your product portfolio with your inventory runout. We talked about inventory runout analysis. How much time do I have? How much inventory do I have until I essentially either have a shortage on parts or raw material? So identify critical customers, align your product portfolio with their requirements, all right, and your runout analyses. Another tip is take a look at your contracts for customer delivery penalties. A lot of folks in these crises don't remember to think about the contractual agreements. So take a look at your contracts. Put your customers on allocation if you have to, and then over communicate with them daily so they understand what's happening on an hour by hour daily basis. And finally, be careful about using the word force majeure. A lot of you might read about this. We use it in the chemical arena. Be wary about using force majeure. Why? Because that may not be in any of your contracts. And if it is, you must demonstrate to your customer that it's just not because of accumulating costs. So just a couple of quick tips associated with your downstream arena called your customers.
All right, thank you, Greg, and thank you as well, Jim. It was great speaking with you. That's all the time we have for Q&A today, but all the questions submitted will be consolidated, and the most popular inquiries will be answered and posted on the ASCM website.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I'd like to thank our co-sponsor, Supply Chain Canada, for being a part of today's webinar. And I'd also like to thank Beth, Jim, and Greg, and all of our participants for your time today. This concludes today's webinar. All content and materials included in this webinar are the property of ASCM and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights reserved.